It's a real honour to open the meeting. As will become apparent, I'm a Earth system scientist and computer modeller and not a botanist, as Diane said, by training, although both my parents were, so maybe I picked some things up from them. So yeah, I want to suggest that the very earliest land plants created modern, breathable for us levels of atmospheric oxygen, which you might be thinking, well, that's kind of intuitively obvious. But actually, the current paradigms out in the geochemical literature, at least, is the last 10 years have been full of papers arguing for Neoproterozoic oxygen rise, so just at the last bit of the Precambrian, some kind of oxygen rise. Or prior to that, the paradigm was that it was with the first forests and, you know, big trees that we saw a rise of oxygen to modern levels. And I'm going to argue that actually all the action was in between, and it was the earliest land plants that really caused a major rise in oxygen. Okay, so what I want to say is, first of all, give you a little bit of review. What do we know about oxygen levels in the atmosphere in the Paleozoic from existing models? And what do the data say? Because there's been a lot of pertinent new data on this. Then I'm going to talk about what controls organic carbon burial, which is what people who study the long-term carbon cycle understand is the most important long-term source of atmospheric oxygen. So it represents that part of photosynthate, if you like, which escapes being respired by anybody and gets buried in new sediments, and that leaves a corresponding amount of oxygen behind, and that's the long-term source to the atmosphere. So we'll look at some controls on that and how they might be affected by early plants, and that'll involve some new modelling work I've been involved in, so an ecophysiological model and then a model of the long-term carbon cycle, which I developed over 10 years ago and I'm updating in this talk. Okay, so let's start with what are different existing models for levels of oxygen in the atmosphere in the Paleozoic. So we've got a range of models here, but the oxygen is always in percent of the atmosphere, at least on these plots, with 21% being the modern level, looking through the Cambrian and through to the end Permian in these plots. Several different models up there which have different kind of structure and understanding behind them. They certainly differ fundamentally over the early to mid Paleozoic oxygen levels. There's several models that Bob Berner famously developed, partly with Don Canfield and others. They typically predict nearer modern levels of oxygen in the Paleozoic. Certainly Berner's recent models do, sometimes above present levels of oxygen in the early Paleozoic. Our model over here, called COPS, predicts much lower than present oxygen levels. All of these predictions are consistent with how much oxygen physiologically early marine animals would have needed, such as the Cambrian fauna. Near modern levels of oxygen in the earliest Paleozoic, though, are not consistent, as we'll see in a minute, with lots of evidence for widespread anoxic waters in the ocean. At the same time, our model isn't right either, because its rise in oxygen, which it predicts in the Devonian and through the Carboniferous, is basically too late. So why do I say, you know, that oxygen rise, which in the original model is driven by the forests, essentially, why is that too late? Well, because we have a charcoal record, and we know some things about how much oxygen you need in the atmosphere to sustain combustion of natural fuels. So combustion experiments in controlled environments tell us that essentially burning of natural fuels goes out at 15 to 17% oxygen by volume. And yet there's incredible early charcoal. Diane's involved in the paper on the earliest, and I've cribbed charcoal, and I've cribbed that from one of their figures. But the various arrows here are known instances of fossil charcoal, charred plant remains. And I've marked on red what I think is the lower limit on oxygen. Some people would put it at 15%, but definitely there's enough oxygen to sustain fires and the burning of plant material that's just crept out onto dry land, if you like, even in the Silurian. So this oxygen rise we predicted here is definitely too late. If we turn to the ocean, without wanting to kind of bamboozle you with geochemistry, there's actually a load of proxies for redox conditions in the ocean, and this is just one of them. It's sort of the molybdenum, so trace metal level relative to total organic carbon in the sediments at the bottom, and then the fractionation of isotopic fractionation of molybdenum. And as I've marked on there, basically in order to get the kind of near approaching modern values of, for example, molybdenum isotope fractionation, above about this level here, you need widespread oxic waters, sedimentary sink for molybdenum in the ocean. And Tysdal and others in this earlier paper essentially argued that there's been some signs of oxygen rise, possibly in the latest Neoproterozoic here, and then maybe it fell back to more anoxic conditions in the Cambrian and early Ordovician, but then it appears to step up again, and the data here is somewhere between the base of the Silurian and the middle of the Devonian. That's the gap between those data points there, and that appears to pinpoint when the deep oceans finally, for the first time in Earth history, became persistently or fully oxygenated. There's also something called ion speciation redox proxy that's essentially highlights the same kind of transformation in the same interval, so somewhere between the start of the Silurian and the mid-Devonian. Mid-Devonian being the time of the first trees, right? And then there's one other pertinent source of data here, which is the carbon isotope record. So if you're not a geochemist, I'll just quickly, which I'm assuming most of you aren't, just quickly run through how did geochemists read this is the carbon isotopic composition of carbonate rocks over time. Well, we read that as telling us something about the proportions of carbon burial as reduced organic matter versus oxidized carbonates. And if the delta 13C of the carbonates gets heavier, goes up, that's saying that there's more burial of isotopically light organic matter, so that leaves the ocean isotopically enriched in 13 carbon, and the carbonates that deposit from the ocean become heavier in 13 carbon, if that makes sense. And over Earth history, if I could draw the line back, we'd have 0 per mil, kind of all the way back to 3.5, 3.8 billion years ago, as the kind of baseline of the carbonate-carbon isotope record. And the thing that I'm pulling out here by sticking some green lines on the plot is that that baseline stepped up here and has gone from 0 per mil, sorry I forgot the per mil sign, to 2 per mil ever since. And that transition seems to be through the late Ordovician, and this is the Silurian data in here. So we would read that as a profound and sort of permanent increase in organic carbon burial in the world's largely marine sediments, or it can be terrestrial as well, but we don't have many preserved from that time. And I just plotted on the bottom the times when we see the separate evidence for ocean oxygenation and charcoal, and therefore a minimum level on atmospheric oxygen, and they all tie together. So in this interval, late Ordovician through Silurian, there seems to be a major increase in organic carbon burial, which is, we think, causally linked to a rise in oxygen in the atmosphere. I just tied the data together in this plot. So I did a little bit more work with my co-authors, just putting together the charcoal record. So the stars with Fs in are charred fossils. The black dots with the sort of error bars on the ages, that's on a scale here of the inertinite, so like the charcoal percentage of coals, where there's other studies suggesting that if that's higher, it hints at higher oxygen. This is the sort of the empty interval of data here, but the fundamental transition in the ocean oxygenation somewhere in here when the charcoal appears, and here's that step up in carbon isotopes and organic carbon burial. It all seems to point to exactly the time when the earliest plants were evolving on the land surface. So apologies for the no doubt out-of-date phylogenetic tree here, which we'll hear much better versions of in the next 2 days, I'm sure. But from my outsider's perspective, I've learned that the first non-vascular plants were clearly colonizing the land during the mid through late Ordovician, first of all revealed by the cryptospore record and then by plant fragments. And the cryptospore record seems now to have fairly global coverage, perhaps suggesting a global coverage of the vegetation. We come into the Silurian, or even actually in the latest Ordovician, I've read the papers that there may be evidence for the trilete spores that could be from vascular plants in the latest Ordovician, certainly by the Silurian. And then we have Diane, and I'm sure many of your work on fossil plants in the Silurian, leaves and roots by the end of the Silurian. We get into the early Devonian, and we start to get fossil evidence of the mycorrhizal symbiosis. We have some evidence for woody material or lignins in early vascular plants then. And recently we also have evidence of peatlands in the form of what are described as coaly shales, not to call them coal directly, but essentially ancient fossilized peat deposits around 410 million years ago. All of that comfortably before the first trees that are usually thought to be the culprits for oxygen rise about 385 million years ago. So I'm going to turn my attention then to the processes and the mechanisms here. See if I can convince you then that early plants might have been able to globally increase the burial of organic matter in the Earth's crust and thus the oxygen level in the atmosphere. So first of all, I'm going to review the kind of controls on organic carbon burial as we understand them today. So this is like the marine route to organic carbon burial. So as geochemists, we think about the amount of carbon you can bury in the world's sediments is ultimately limited by the nutrient supply of phosphorus, which ultimately comes from weathering on the land surface, multiplied by the carbon to phosphorus ratio of the material you bury. And in the ocean, marine algal matter is produced at least with a carbon to phosphorus ratio near the Redfield ratio, famously 106. When it's kind of processed in marine sediments through diagenesis, so you sometimes see increases in that carbon to phosphorus ratio so that maybe the mean shifts upward to more like 250. And that's a big pathway of carbon burial, marine organic matter getting buried, but it's only basically half of today's organic carbon burial flux. The other half is the burial of terrestrially derived photosynthetic material. Of course, much of this is buried in the ocean, but it's of terrestrial origin. And the big thing that's different with terrestrial plants, as I'm sure many of you know, is they have a much higher carbon to phosphorus ratio than marine algae or cyanobacteria, because they're full of structural, carbon-rich but nutrient-poor compounds, as are their fungal symbionts. So a typical sort of ballpark figure for plant carbon to phosphorus ratio is an order of magnitude higher than for marine algal or cyanobacterial matter. So you only need a much sort of smaller fraction of the phosphorus flux from weathering to be diverted to the land and then multiplied up by this much larger carbon to phosphorus ratio to explain why half of today's carbon burial is actually plant-derived, land plant-derived material. So that's kind of, it's actually fairly standard stuff in the world I come from in geochemistry. And the question we're going to look at now is, well, could the earliest plants have really made a significant contribution along this pathway of terrestrially derived matter for burial? We would think, for example, that the weathering here is not necessarily independent of the vegetation cover. Indeed, I would make the case that phosphorus weathering could be enhanced considerably by early vegetation cover, as we see. Also, the more vegetation you'd have on the land, the more you'd expect to divert some of this weathering flux via this pathway to be sort of trapped ultimately in the rocks as buried terrestrial plant material. So I want to try and get a handle on what could the productivity of the earliest biota have been, because that's going to play some control in this this flux and this pathway here. And I'm also going to review in a minute what do we know about the carbon to phosphorus ratios of non-vascular plants, sort of modern analogues for the earliest land plants. So let's start with productivity. How on earth are we going to estimate the productivity of the earliest land plant biota? Modelers are brave or foolhardy, and we've done this by taking, first of all, a model of the late Ordovician climate. So this is a fairly state-of-the-art, by the way, climate model, general circulation model, the French LMDZ model, one that's used in that Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's recent assessments. But we've obviously changed the paleogeography to be sort of late Ordovician location of the continents, and we've dialed up the CO2 level in the atmosphere. I'm showing the simulation for 8 times the present atmospheric level. Sorry, that's what PAL stands for, of CO2, because several different models agree that that's roughly the level consistent with triggering the glaciations we know that happened at the end of the Ordovician in the Hadantian stage. we don't need to take too much from this, but it's kind of typical situation. You have a nice wet band through the tropics where the intertropical convergence zone of rainfall is. You have some sort of deserts either side of that, just as you'd imagine see in today's world. And then you have a sort of wet temperate regions, which of course are cooler. All looks kind of sensible, and we've got solar insolation because we've got clouds in the model and so on and so forth. The more interesting thing is we use this climate model and the CO2 level and an assumption about the oxygen level to then drive a eco-physiological model of cryptogamic cover. So something that was developed by Philip Parada, my co-author here, for his PhD. He developed this trait-based eco-physiological model of cryptogamic cover in which you can have many, many species. So you have to prescribe in the model the kind of key traits and the trade-offs between them and ground that in empirical lab data and so on. But then you can populate, and we're going to populate our model world here with, say, typically 600 of these species, if you like, chosen from this eco-physiological trait space, and just let them compete it out and see who survives and what productivity they have in this Ordovician world. And that's what you get for the predicted net primary productivity of what's actually could be, in the eco-physiological sense, I'm calling it cryptogamic cover because it could be lichens or bryophytes here. You have, if you know anything about this stuff, you have a Farquhar type photosynthesis model, but you have crucially the diffusion of CO2 being affected by moisture levels for these types of organisms. And what do we get? Well, where it's dry in the deserts, we get very low productivity, all makes sense. Where it's super wet here, it's very high productivity, and around here it's pretty high productivity. We've set the oxygen level consistent with some simulations I'll show you later, assuming that it's kind of coming up at this time in the late Ordovician. Add it all up globally, you get a global net primary productivity estimate that's about 30% of today's vascular and non-vascular plant cover. Quite a lot higher than one or two other estimates that have been made. But there it is. That's what the physiological model gives us. Why does it give us a high value? Well, because it says that there's a pretty strong CO2 fertilization effect on these organisms, which we could discuss at the end. But we can look at the sensitivity of its estimates for global net primary productivity to varying the CO2 level, and when we vary the CO2 level here, we're also varying the climate. So each of these dots is like a rerun of the climate model with all the attendant changes in climate and water cycle and blah, 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 as well as the CO2. And you see a pretty strong and somewhat non-linear response of predicted net primary production for this putative late Ordovician biosphere to varying the CO2 in the climate. So if you're curious, some of the changes down here and the sort of drop-off is because in the model we start to trigger the ice cover in a big way and cooling of the planet in a big way down here. We've done all the due sensitivity studies, like you monkey around with the oxygen level in the atmosphere and you find that that doesn't have nearly as big an effect as the CO2, but it has an effect, and so forth. We then have to ask ourselves, well, is this strong CO2 fertilization that the physiological model is predicting reasonable or within the bounds of plausibility? So this might be a good topic actually for the discussion, because on the left I'm kind of showing you some model predictions for an organism in pink that's sort of acclimated or adapted genetically to today's CO2 and climate, and in blue one that's kind of been picked out of this Ordovician model world, acclimated or adapted to a high CO2 and an Ordovician climate. And the one in blue that's adapted to the Ordovician, when we normalized its MPP response, you see it has this sensitivity that carries on up to higher CO2 levels. Both of them actually in this physiological model are predicted to have quite strong CO2 sensitivity around today's kind of level. The data over here on the right, some existing experimental data does suggest similarly strong CO2 responses for lichens or bryophytes. Others disagree, so this is a point for discussion. But we think, and we make a case in the paper, that it's physiologically plausible that organisms adapted to and also acclimating to the changing conditions at this time could have quite a strong CO2 sensitivity. and it's not completely outside the range of some things that have been seen in experiments. So that is all to say that maybe this earliest biosphere was quite productive. Not quite as productive as today's, but pretty productive. So then we've got to ask, well, what would we be multiplying that productivity by? And what's the carbon to phosphorus ratio of this early plant material? And I was kind of stunned when I plodded through the literature for a month last autumn and pulled out the data I could find for carbon to phosphorus ratios of extant non-vascular plants. You'll see that most of this is sphagnum moss, by the way. That's what's been studied to death by ecologists in the tundra, especially. But they, extant non-vascular plants have very high carbon to phosphorus ratios, despite the fact that they're not obviously not full of lignin and wood at all. So is this something to do with chitin in their fungal partners, as well as other carbon-rich but nutrient-poor structural parts of the moss or the bryophyte itself? I'm not quite sure, but the data's there. Also, of course, bryophytes famously in wet settings deposit peatlands, peat bogs, which are the things that go on to form coal in the fossil record. And if you look in a modern peat bog with depth, you can measure the carbon to nitrogen and carbon to phosphorus ratios. It's being done, I wouldn't say to death, but it's been done in ecology. And those carbon to nutrient ratios go up with depth, which is hardly surprising. There's preferential recycling of the nutrients near the surface of the bog, or there's leaching out. So that the stuff that eventually gets deposited, if it makes its way in the right sedimentological setting to become a coal of the future, a coal deposit of the future, has a very high carbon to phosphorus ratio. And as I've mentioned, there's now some evidence for coaly shales by the earliest Devonian. So I think this earliest biosphere surprisingly had pretty high carbon to phosphorus ratios and could have buried that material, even if it's washed into the ocean. It's high carbon to phosphorus material. So let's then think finally about whether the earliest plants could have affected weathering rates. And as some of you know, several of us have been working on this. So with Liam Dolan and others, Mike Crouch and a crowd of people, we did some experiments with a modern moss, Physcomitrella, the model moss species, and growing that moss. You actually saw it in the title slide, and I forgot to tell you what it was. You saw it in the title slide growing on basalt. We grew it on andesite and granite and vermiculite, a range of silicate rocks. And if you just grow the moss directly on the rock, it does quite a good job of accelerating the dissolution of the silicate rock it's living on. I think this is entirely understandable in terms of natural selection. This was a model system where there wasn't any other source of nutrients, and for all life on land, the ultimate source of phosphorus is to mine it out of rocks. So my personal hunch is that it's phosphorus, the desire to access phosphorus and some other rock-bound nutrients. That's why terrestrial plants, including this one, are very good at dissolving silicate rocks. So we express this effect as a sort of amplification factor, we call it, of weathering relative to unvegetated controls, which are kind of the blue, paley blue areas. We tried to estimate the phosphorus weathering in our experiments because unfortunately we didn't directly measure the phosphorus content of the moss from the experiments. And I have revised those numbers since we originally published them, and because some people have been critiquing the number we originally put out there, which was up to a factor of 60 amplification of phosphorus weathering. So I had a careful relook at that, and I can tell you the lower bound effect on phosphorus weathering, if you assume there was no phosphorus in the moss at all, which isn't physiologically plausible, but there you go, that would give you a 14-fold amplification of phosphorus weathering if you only consider the phosphorus that's gone into solution in the mossy microcosms compared to the controls. But if you assume some plausible amount of phosphorus in the moss, well, that's your range for the weathering amplification. It's very big compared to, for example, the amplification of weathering for the bulk sort of ions of calcium and magnesium. So that says to me this is preferential weathering of phosphorus relative to the sort of bulk calcium and magnesium in these silicate rocks, and that's not totally surprising and is remarked on in many other studies for plant weathering effects. So Joe Quirk and David Spearling's group have also done some nice experiments with weathering, in this case with liverworts growing with mycorrhizae on basalt. And in their experiments, the numbers I pulled out from their paper, 9 to 13-fold amplification of phosphorus weathering compared to 2.5 to 7-fold amplification of calcium weathering. So I would just take from that one point, which is that there seems to be preferential weathering of phosphorus relative to the bulk rock dissolution, which will be important in a minute with some more modelling. Let's go back briefly to our physiological model of the world with these mosses, these bryophytes and potentially, possibly lichens, who knows, living in it. We tried to do some calculations of what we call weathering potential of this early plant cover. And this is here it gets tricky because we come out with some very, very high numbers. Even though we kind of cap the weathering by the erosional supply of new rocks over there, and also by the runoff supply of water that can essentially keep refreshing the water in the soil profile and take the dissolved products away or into the moss. Even when we cap the weathering with these physical constraints, we still get very high numbers, and that's because this is assumed to be a kind of a world in which, from modern observations, we know that bryophytes do not, in their ecosystems, don't do a lot of phosphorus recycling compared to a modern vascular plant world. And so this is a bit like, not quite, almost like colonizing the bare rock. We can debate whether that's realistic and whether or how quickly soils would have built up as the colonization happened. But we certainly know from modern ecological data that phosphorus recycling is pretty minimal in these kind of cryptogamic covers compared to in a modern, tree-lined terrestrial ecosystem. You typically have phosphorus recycled 50 times in the ecosystem through photosynthesis before it's lost down rivers, whereas it's assumed to be a recycling factor of 5 in these cryptogam covers. We can simulate, the weathering potential of this world, and it's the bold line compared to what we think the abiotic weathering rates would be in the pale grey. And the abiotic ones here are governed by a model of the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere diffusing down into the soils, making acid, carbonic acid, and dissolving the rocks away in the same way that Bob Berner, myself, and others parameterize it in our global models. And we see this big potential sensitivity of the biotically driven weathering, especially at lower CO2 levels. We get some interesting things like you can monkey around in this model and change the diversity of the biosphere in the model. And at low diversity, you don't have enough of a range of sort of eco-physiological strategies for the simulated biosphere to sort of achieve its potential productivity. And that's what happens down there. So that might hint that when the first diversification of land life happened, it could have a significant effect on this particular biogeochemical flux. And we've done all, due sensitivity studies of this to come out with some estimates for a very considerable weathering potential. My hunch is that as plants are colonizing the land, if they're genuinely colonizing fairly bare rock surfaces at least, you do have an enormous potential for weathering, especially of phosphorus. And then you would expect soils and recycling would establish and the weathering rates would drop. So what I tried to do is take all of that stuff I've been hitting you with, all of those different bits of information about possible productivity of earliest biosphere, carbon to phosphorus ratios of said biosphere, and potential effect of early biosphere on weathering, and play around with those in my long-term model of the carbon cycle, which is called COPS, carbon, oxygen, phosphorus, sulfur evolution, was where we got the acronym from. And obviously we were thinking trees when we came up with the acronym. Anyway, I'm now thinking pre-trees. So I've gone back to the model and I've done some things, and we're going to see a load of studies in a minute, a load of coloured lines for how different combinations of different effects could have affected the global carbon cycle and the oxygen level in the atmosphere. So I've updated the colonization of the land by plants in this long-term model. So now we're going to go from a spatial model to a look at a model that runs over tens and hundreds of millions of years and has sedimentary reservoirs of all the important things here, and those get recycled over geologic timescales. And in these models, we have to sort of prescribe, in some sense, their evolution or land colonization. And what I've done here is I've I've put in a stronger phase of early colonization, and I've kind of put in the late Ordovician there. When it says was 475 to 460, that refers to our 2012 paper with myself, Liam, Nature Geoscience. Part of this adjustment in timing is because geologists have got a better chronology on this bit of the Paleozoic in the meantime. But I basically got to prescribe some forcing, which I've done in a way that we reproduce what the spatial model thinks is a reasonable global productivity of about 30% of modern. This long-term geochemical model does have a Farquhar-type photosynthesis model in it as well. It just can't handle having all the species and whatnot. I put it in italics. Note for simplicity, we do not consider early additional expansion of vascular plants through the Silurian, which I have played with if you want to ask me a question about it afterwards. I just wanted to kind of do as few things as possible in the scenario. And our standard model had this value for the carbon to phosphorus ratio of land plant matter. But I want to monkey around and see, well, I've observed that these modern non-vascular plants have a ratio nearer 2,000, so we're going to have a look at what that does in a minute. And we've seen in the experiments that there's some effect on the bulk dissolution of the crust, the silicate weathering, and I put a pretty conservative number in there for the global amplification of silicate weathering. That's the same as what we used in our previous study. And then remember, I'm arguing that there's also this selective weathering of phosphorus relative to the bulk silicate weathering, and I'm going to play with that as well. And you might be wondering, why is that important, Tim? Basically, we've got a complicated model here. It has a carbon dioxide long-term cycle, and the carbon dioxide cycle has to balance in the long term, and that is set by, in simple terms, carbon dioxide that comes in from volcanoes is an input flux and has to be balanced by an equal output flux of silicate weathering. So on truly long time scales we look at here, you can't change the output flux of silicate weathering unless you change the input flux of carbon from degassing, we call it, from volcanoes. So the one sets the other, and if plants come along and they accelerate weathering, they draw down atmospheric carbon dioxide and temperature until the weathering flux again manages to balance the input flux from volcanoes. And it does so at a lower CO2 and temperature when you have acids and ligands and other things that are biologically produced that accelerate weathering. But if the plants selectively go after phosphorus in the rocks, they can kind of decouple their effects on the phosphorus cycle from this fundamental constraint on the CO2 cycle. So apologies if that was more detail than you wanted to know, but you'll see that this selective weathering of phosphorus, if it's true, is really important in the long term. And I'm going to mess around with playing with the idea that as plants colonize the land, they might have done so in phases. As I hinted at before, we might have seen phases on colonizing certainly bare rocks where you would see big pulses of phosphorus weathering, but then things would settle down again as the ecosystem developed a soil and recycled phosphorus. So we might see spikes of phosphorus weathering. We're nearly there. So here we have our baseline model, the old model, going from the sort of early Ordovician, 480 million years ago, to, I've picked it up to 360 million years ago, which I guess is end Devonian. We got on the left the carbon isotope composition of carbonate rocks. Remember that record that sat at 0 per mil through Earth history, and in the original model it also sitting pretty close to 0. And on the right we've got the oxygen level in the atmosphere relative to the present level of 1. Original model predicted like 20% of the present oxygen level in the early Paleozoic. I got other variants of the model which might bring it up to 40%, but it's well below present. There's a little bit of an upturn here, and that's because the original model published back in 2004, we did assume, like Bob Berner does, that the vascular plants that are starting to kick in here have an effect, and that's what's kicking that up. But the problem is we're not explaining the 2 per mil data here or the charcoal that suggests high oxygen in here. So what happens if you just change the plant forcing? So with the low carbon to phosphorus ratio, not a huge amount, but you get now some earlier greater production of plant material, some of which gets buried. That shifts up this organic carbon burial and carbon isotope record. and pushes up the oxygen. In fact, it nearly doubles the oxygen level, but from a very low starting point. Now I want to put in a more realistic carbon to phosphorus ratio, because I hopefully convinced you that at least modern non-vascular plants have a high carbon to phosphorus ratio. That bumps things up more. We get more organic carbon burial. The delta 13C record here goes up. The oxygen goes up again a fair chunk, but not quite high enough, I'm afraid, to explain the charcoal, which would need it to be about 0.6 to 0.7 of the present level at 420 million years ago. So what about if I put in an effect on silicate weathering, bulk dissolution of the crust, but I've taken out my carbon to phosphorus effect? I'm stuck down here again, and I'm somewhere in the middle for oxygen, for reasons I can't explain, but maybe in the questions would be better. If I combine that with the higher carbon to phosphorus ratio, I get the green line. Now we're starting to get in business. Now we're getting near to what we would need to explain the incidence of charcoal in here, although it's not quite high enough, and it's not really reproducing the 2 per mil in the carbon isotope record that it's trying to forward predict. So finally, I start putting in some effects on phosphorus weathering. I'm sorry, that's in a colour you can hardly see, so let's have a look at the next one in red. That's easier. Now we've got the early plant colonization, we've got their high carbon to phosphorus ratio, we've got them affecting the bulk rock weathering, and a little bit of a selective effect on phosphorus weathering. And suddenly you can kind of reproduce the observed 2 per mil in the isotopes and get an oxygen prediction that's consistent with the charcoal we observe in here, and gives you a great big oxygenation of the ocean that we also observe and I told you about. And there's one other scenario which, rather than sort of have this big rise and plateau in the phosphorus weathering, it monkeys around with that idea of phases of land colonization, and then deliberately try to reproduce a load of spikes in the carbon isotope record by hypothesizing phases of land colonization, intense phosphorus weathering, and then relaxation back to phosphorus recycling systems. And that's what that one looks like. So this is kind of designed to reproduce the structure that's in the carbon isotope record, which has all of these spikes of these kind of heights. And sure enough, because that's all basically a measure of organic carbon burial, the oxygen's stepping up with it, and again would be pretty consistent with the charcoal data in here. So either the red or the black line is looking like something that we can reconcile with our independent data. If you're curious, of course, things are happening in other bits of the model world, including to the carbon dioxide level on the left and the climate on the right. And the big difference in the scenarios here is just which ones have an effect of the biosphere on silicate weathering, bulk silicate weathering. They're all the scenarios clustered down here, versus the blue ones where there's no big effect on silicate weathering. But you see the model predicting a big drop in CO2 and temperature that we were originally using to explain late Ordovician glaciations in here. But you can see that this model makes maybe a falsifiable prediction that there's ongoing coldish conditions in the Silurian with possibly some further glacial intervals. There's also predictions in a complicated geochemical model like this of the changes in the sulfur cycle. Sulfur is important, maybe not, I don't know how much we care about it as botanists, but it's certainly important in the long-term oxygen balance, because it's another kind of redox sensitive element where you get burial either as oxidized sulfur gypsum deposits or reduced sulfur called pyrite. Basically the model, as you see, making all kinds of predictions of changes in pyrite sulfur burial. This is the sulfur isotope composition of sulfate rocks, carbonate associated sulfate it's called. This is the sulfate concentration in the ocean that the model predicts, and this is the carbon to sulfur ratio of shales or carbon rich sedimentary deposits that it predicts. And I can tell you that these predictions are quite good because we have independent data that the sulfate concentration of the ocean roughly doubled through this interval, that we know famously that the carbon to sulfur ratio of shales, Rob Bracewell, Bob Burner described this in the 70s, really spikes up in the Silurian, which is what the model predicts here. And this long-term sulfur isotope record, I haven't got the figure of it, but we have a compilation of that, and it does indeed nosedive during this Silurian interval. So these are some independent predictions and tests of the model. Then if you're a skeptic, you're going to say, well, does it have to be the plants, Tim? Could geologic forcing cause the oxygen rise or these changes in all these geochemical indicators? So I've taken like upper and lower plausible bounds on the main geologic forcings in my model. And these are called degassing up here, which is like how much CO2, etc. is coming out of volcanoes, and uplift over here, which is like how much mountain range creation do we have, how much uplift of the continents. And even if we take the extreme combinations of those, but without the plant forcing, I'm afraid we can't explain the +2 per mil carbon isotope data, which would be up here, or the charcoal in here. I mean, we get some oxygen rise and this carbon isotope rise, but again, that's because even the original model had a role for vascular plants kicking in at this point in the late Silurian and early Devonian. So I want to suggest that not only do these first plants create breathable for us levels of oxygen for the first time, but we also know something about how oxygen is then regulated once we have a world with plants. So this effect of vegetation on phosphorus weathering, for example, then determines how much phosphorus is supplied to the land and ocean, like I was showing earlier. That determines the amount of carbon that will get buried in the ocean and therefore the long-term source of oxygen to the atmosphere. So more land vegetation, more oxygen. Hopefully we've got that point by now. And of course, when you've got enough oxygen, you get fires. But fires, we think, ultimately limit land vegetation, certainly in biomass terms. Some estimates, certainly Ian Woodward and co-authors estimated that there's a halving of present-day biomass by the suppression effect of fires in today's world. We think that that gives a long-term negative feedback on oxygen levels. You could also draw a line from oxygen to land vegetation to acknowledge the effect, the detrimental effect of oxygen on carbon fixation by rubisco, which would again give you a negative feedback that in our existing model is crucial to regulating oxygen ever since plants basically push it up. So they both push it up and then in-kicks this new stabilizing mechanism that's held oxygen near the present level for the last 400 million years and eventually allowed animals like us to evolve and enjoy it. So to conclude, I hope I've persuaded you that even directly from the geochemical data, there was a major mid-Paleozoic oxygenation event, and it was done and dusted by 390 million years ago, before the first trees, as far as I understand it, but coincident with the rise of earlier land plants. It turns out that non-vascular plants, at least the ones alive today, have very high carbon to phosphorus ratios, and they support high carbon to phosphorus peatlands that can sometimes get preserved. They enhance silicate weathering. They seem to selectively weather phosphorus weathering. They might have had a pretty high productivity, maybe up to 30% of modern in the late Ordovician, as an example, climate. And those combination of those things, the high C to P ratios, the selective phosphorus weathering, etc., that's what can explain the geochemical data and the evidence that oxygen reached modern levels by about 400 million years ago. Thank you.